Hello, this is Randy Ellefson from WorldBuilding University and the Art of Worldbuilding. You are about to watch the replay of WorldBuilding webinar number 1 from July of 2020. So I'm going to start with a relatively simple question here from Joseph, and he asked, how do you organize your WorldBuilding notes? I know you use templates presented in the back of the books, but those only cover individual items. So he wanted to know if I use software or websites like World Anvil. So basically, my way of doing this has changed over the years, and I was doing WorldBuilding long before sites like World Anvil, so I already had my way of doing things, and I never really looked into those sites other than just curiosity. One thing about sites like that is you're basically following someone else's organizational structure or the way they lay out their notes. And if it works for you, that's great, but if it doesn't, maybe not so much. So the way I do everything, almost all of my WorldBuilding files are Microsoft Word files. I use Excel spreadsheets for high-level information. Like if I want to see the city colors, population, or the year it was founded for all of my cities at once, I have that all on one spreadsheet, partly so that when I'm inventing it, I will actually invent it on that spreadsheet so that I don't have 10 places that were all founded in the year 101 because I wasn't paying attention and I didn't see it because it's spread across 50 files and I'm not opening all of them to double check. So that's one way I do that. For organizing the files, I basically use the folder structure in Windows. And this has changed at times. And one example I'll give you is that I have, say, 7 species on this one planet, and that used to be 7 different files. Each one of them was organized like my templates in the back of the book. However, these days I've got all of them in one file, and the reason for this is that I discovered the navigation pane in Microsoft Word. It's under, let's see if I can pull it up while I'm talking to you. It's under View, I believe. And once you pull it up, yeah, it's just a toggle button called navigation pane. And what this does is it pulls up a structure of your document, and you can collapse it, you can expand it, and you can click on one of the headings and you will jump right to that. So for something like species, I find that when I'm working on one species, I tend to make comments about another one. And then if I have 7 files, I just end up opening all these files, and now I've got all this open. And I have found it's easier to just have it in one file because I jump back and forth. On the other hand, something like cities, when I'm working on a city, I'm not probably worrying about another city too much. So those are all separate files. Today I've got, because of writing this series, all my life forms are in a folder called life. You know, all the gods are in there in one folder, or a file, species and all that. You know, I have a folder almost per each chapter of the Creating Life book. And then again with Creating Places, I have kind of the same thing. There's a folder called that on my file system, and that's where I've got all the stuff about places. And then there's another one for Cultures and Beyond, which is the catch-all for everything else. So that organization has been working for me for a while. But one thing I will say is that whatever your organization is, you know, try it for a while. If it's not working, you're going to notice, and you're going to at some point pull back and go, okay, this has been bothering me for a while, and here's why. Let me change something else. So that's how I go about doing that. He also asked a related question: is how do I start my world building? How do I prefer, with bottom up or top down? And my answer to that is that it depends. Top down is when you start at the planet and you work your way down to a continent and smaller sovereign powers, cities, and all the way down. And the bottom up, of course, would be the reverse. If I'm working on a world that I intend to use a lot or for a longer series, that I will do top down, especially if it's something like a Lord of the Rings style story where they're going to be traveling a lot and the wider world is actually relevant. Well, then I need to think about that wider world and all the different places they're going to go, not just within a sovereign power, but across different ones. Maybe they're even going to other continents or even other planets. So in that sense, the scope is larger. So therefore, I start at the larger scope. On the other hand, if I'm doing a short story in a setting I'm only going to use once, I start at the bottom and I work my way up. And I base everything based on what I need in the story. Some of these, you know, this bottom up and top down, I mix them at times. So it really depends on what is best for your needs, but I do focus a little bit on how large the story is and how wide it is to determine how wide my world building is and whether I start at the wide picture and work my way down or do the opposite. His last question was about what I use for maps and whether I commission people. I actually use Campaign Cartographer, which is from Pro Fantasy. This has a bit of a learning curve. For me, it's, I've gotten to the point where I'm reasonably good at it. I have never commissioned something, but if you're looking for ways to commission people, if you go on Facebook, there are lots of cartography and map making groups on there, and people post their maps. So you can see what people do in different kinds of programs. And then lots of times someone posts a really good map and someone says, hey, do you do commissions? And they will often say yes. And so then they can just work that out through Facebook Messenger or whatever. So that's a good way to find people who do that. So I hope that is helpful to you. I'm going to move on to one of April's questions. She asked, she said basically she's working on a fantasy myth drama TV series that takes place across 3 different planets. And will I need to create interesting sorts of portals for the characters to go between worlds, and what are the pros and cons of this? Well, I would say that a portal is sort of your default option, and that's probably why you asked about it. The other basic way is using a spell. Both of these are basically magic, but one of the things I would say is that we want to decide, does a wizard need to actually get you from one place to another? Let's say I'm a wizard and you want to go between worlds. Do you need to actually come to me and I have to personally do that for you? Or is there a device somewhere and you can use the device? And in that case, there's still going to be one of 2 options, I think. Either you still need a wizard or someone with magical power to control the device, just turning it on, making sure you go to where you said you want to go, or it's just a magic item that's set up kind of like an elevator. You just get in and you press the button or something, and it always goes there. And if all the wizards die, it still works. So I think we can ask ourselves these questions and decide, which way we want to go. And one of the things we often should do is find restrictions. So I've created portals like this before, and I've had them guarded. I've decided that some of them are lost. Another question is, can it be picked up and moved, or is it in a fixed spot? And what these allow us to do is to decide on a case-by-case basis whether it's easy for someone to use that or they just get stuck. So, do they need someone else to help them with this? And we can have problems such as a gate leading to a specific place, but now that place is, can you see through the gate and see what's on the other side? If you've ever watched Stargate, they never could tell. They had to go through, and sometimes they walk right into a battle, or as soon as they get there, they get captured. So there are things that we can do with these portals that can make it more useful to us. And you asked about pros and cons. We can add cons. I don't know if there's really pros and cons for us as world builders, but we can add them for the characters. So hopefully that is helpful. Thank you for, it says Hedge Writer. Sorry, I don't know the name on there, but thank you for posting the link to Pro Fantasy for everyone. They've also got other things. I use the Campaign Cartographer, which is the Overland Maps one. They've got dungeon maps. They've got star system maps. They've got all sorts of cool stuff that you can purchase and do if you have the time. And you don't need the ability to draw, which is why I use them, because I cannot draw to save my life. So the next question that I have here is from Abigail. And she asked, how much world building should I do on a culture that will not be the main setting for the story, but it will be the culture of the main character? So for example, let's say the story is happening in the United States, but the main character is from Japan. It's that kind of scenario. So I would say this depends. How much do you want the culture to impact the plot or the thoughts of the characters and their interactions? One of our uses for culture is essentially people not getting things right. If we're all from the same culture and we all meet all the expectations, then it doesn't really come up. We don't even notice our own culture half the time. It's when someone does something wrong that we notice they didn't do it. And sometimes that's from a cultural expectation. So one way to answer that question for you is to decide how much do you want to have this impacting the way that person gets along in the setting where they are. The more similar the cultures, the less world building of those cultures we need to do. I would focus on elements that you have an interest in, or you have an idea for how that can impact things. And another issue there is to reveal the character's thoughts, prejudices, and their judgments. And that can help us come up with a way to decide how we can comment on that, because we don't necessarily want to say in exposition, here's the culture of this place. We want to have people reacting to mistakes that people make. And it's one thing for someone to just think about that, but it's more impactful if I see, let's say I'm the character and I see a cultural mistake that someone makes, I'm not going to think about it from the cultural standpoint. I'm just going to think, you should have held the door for me or something like that. And maybe I say something to you and you get into an argument with me, and next thing you know, we're in a fight, we get arrested, and then my magic items are confiscated, and now there's a plot problem because I needed those to do something. That's the kind of use that we can use for that and insert it really smoothly so that people never realize we're telling you cultural stuff that we've come up with. Let's see. Another thing that I have here is that she asked, how much world building should I do for cultures that other characters belong to when those cultures will only be visited briefly, but the characters from those cultures will be present throughout most of the story? I would say it's basically the same answer. Decide how much you want that to impact what they're doing and how they're thinking and feeling, and whether this changes any plot actions. If you're looking for ways of things to go wrong so that not everything happens as you planned it, cultural mistakes are a good way to have characters run afoul of something. They could be trying to ask a king for reinforcements and they don't bow deeply enough, and that's an offense, and the king is touchy. That's the end of that. This is an easy way to have things go wrong. And if you guys have any other questions, feel free to drop them in. I do have a couple others that I'm gonna look at here. Hopefully I'm not talking too fast for you guys. All right, James has a question here. He said his work in progress has a very detailed world that needs to be measured out to the reader in stages. I need some ways to do this, especially when the backstory and the lore of the world is key to the larger plot. And he said it's going to be between 4 and 8 book series and maybe various spin-offs and short stories. So one of the ways that I will do something like this is I might take everything that I want to write and write it down as exposition. Not that I'm actually going to take the exposition and dump it into the story, but what I'm doing is I'm getting down all of my thoughts about what I want to say, and I will do a certain amount of self-editing while I'm doing this, so that if I realize, okay, I don't need to say this or that, so I'll just cut that out. Because part of what we want to avoid is accidentally hitting someone over the head with all this information up front, and they just don't know what they're supposed to focus on. Why should I care about this or that? What's my takeaway? So let's say that we write down our exposition, and it's about 10 paragraphs of stuff that we want to explain. Obviously, that's too much to just front load on somebody, and we don't want to do the dreaded prologue where we do all that backstory. And something like the Star Wars films, they always do that little scrolling text, but if you really look at what's on there, at most it's about a paragraph. They separate it into 3 paragraphs, but each one is about 2 sentences. So my personal limit for exposition that I try to enforce is I only do about a paragraph at once. And so let's say we've written down 10 paragraphs. We're not going to give that all to the reader at once. What we can then do is pick that apart into chunks and then figure out where in our book we need to have explained something by. And what I'm thinking of is a kind of a deadline. Let's say that in order to understand what happens in book 1, chapter 13, you need to understand paragraph 3 of those 10 paragraphs that I have already written. So now I have a deadline. I have to find somewhere in the book before then to explain this so you understand the scene. But it also depends on the scene. If it's an action scene, then it either needs to be explained before or after, because the last thing you want to do is be in the middle of a sword fight, for example, and you go, time out, let me explain what's going on here. And then after that, you go back to the action. I think we all know we shouldn't do that. But what I'm getting at is there are times where, so maybe the reader needs to understand that at the time, but we may be able to get that across in not in exposition, but we may be able to get it across in dialogue between characters where they are essentially talking about the thing that needs to be understood, or we can have a character thinking about this issue. And these are 2 of my favorite ways to get in exposition without actually writing exposition. One of the complaints about exposition is that it basically stops our story as long as we're explaining. And on this note, that is a good point, but in writing, there are what I think of as the police. There's the exposition police, there are the point of view police. These are typically other authors who can sometimes be really hard on themselves and hard on other authors about something like exposition. When I say that my limit for exposition is about a paragraph, that's the limit I impose on myself as a writer. Someone else might say, well, that's way too much. I'd never do that. And you're certainly entitled to your opinion. My point is that you're probably going to run into people like beta readers or even an editor you hire who tell you this is too much, you got to cut this. I would always listen to these comments, but I also take them with a grain of salt because some people are going to be really flexible about it. Other people are going to be really mad. There are books that were written decades ago, some of the classics, where there are page after page of exposition, and people got away with it. Of course, we're modern authors, so maybe we don't want to do that. But one of the things we need to do is decide what is our personal limit, and then how do we want to navigate that. So let's say we've got our 10 paragraphs. We've split it up into 10 scenes that we need to show, or before those 10 moments, we need to show this information. These are some of the ways that we can do this. And my favorite way, another one, is to incorporate it into the scene so that it actually impacts what is happening. The last resort is to just use some exposition. It is still better to do thoughts. You can take a paragraph of exposition and subtly alter that to the character's thoughts and reactions about that exposition, and it comes across very differently because it comes across as that character's thoughts about what's going on. I also want to use an example of history because we've got a really good example going on right now in the United States. The Civil War happened a long time ago, and I think it was 1860s roughly. I'm not exactly sure when, but still over 100 years ago. And some of us would say, well, this is not relevant anymore. Well, it actually is, because even roughly 50 years later, in the 1920s, a lot of statues to Confederate soldiers and generals went up. And I'm not sure why that happened. I only recently found out about this because of some of what's going on right now in 2020. But that's a decent period of 40 or 50 years before that government or attempted government even put these up. Thank you, Glenn. Yeah. So, that's great. 1861, 1865. I was thinking 1863. So I was right in the middle there. But what I was saying is that sometimes a government will put up these things that are still around even 100, 150 years later. But in this case, it wasn't until the 1920s that a huge amount of these statues were erected. So that's like 50 years later that people are then erecting these. So, and now we have the situation where it's 100 years after that. And because of the death of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement, these statues are being either taken down or removed, and it's suddenly become a very relevant thing in today's society, despite the fact that this Civil War and some of what has led to it after that it's been so long ago. So this is one way that we can use this. And what I'm getting at here is, let's say you had, I don't know what your setting is. So let's say it was the US and we had a statue that's been removed, and now there's just an empty pedestal where the statue used to be on the top. We can have a character, whether white or black, come around the corner and see this, whether it's been vandalized or there are protesters happening, doing protesting right now, but see this and react to it and use that as a springboard into talking about the history that we have that is relevant. And not only can we do that, but it's even better if that then impacts something. Let's say the character sees this and they get mad about whatever's happening. I'm trying not to get into the politics of this, but if they start doing an inner monologue and they start working themselves up, maybe they've got a chip on their shoulder about this issue, and now they're in a bad mood, and next thing you know, they're picking a fight with somebody, not a fist fight, but they're a spouse or one of their friends or someone who's in their group that they need to do things with, and next thing you know, they're having an argument, and that changes the way things go. Maybe that argument is really loud, and next thing they're trying to be quiet, but the guy's pissed off, he's not paying attention, and there are guards nearby who come to see what the commotion is. Next thing you know, there's a problem. So what we're talking about is weaving that all the way together, so we've got a combination of seeing something that's left over, inner monologuing about it, and then maybe some dialogue about it, and then an action happens that changes the course of the book or causes problems for our characters. Let me read Abigail's comment here real quick. All right, well, I'm glad I was able to help you, Abigail. Feel free to always chime in with more questions, especially I'm hoping we can do more of these webinars, maybe every other week, depending on how things go. So I have two other main areas of questions here. I want to actually look up here in the chat. Someone else had typed something. Give me 1 second. So Glenn asked, how do you know when you brought something from today's use into a story and that it is distracting to a story? That is a good question. One of the criticisms we sometimes get is when someone says the voice of the narrator is intruding on the story. Um, but one of the things that people also talk about is some people want art that comments on today's issues, and some people don't. You know, as a musician and a fan of 80s rock music, you know, a lot of the songs are about fast cars and girls. You know, there's no social issue on a lot of them. And a lot of people were fine with that, but some people thought all these songs are really shallow. You know, they don't speak to anybody. Well, then in the 1990s, you know, there was the switch with grunge music and Nirvana showing up and the whole Seattle music scene. And so suddenly everyone's talking about their feelings and how depressed they are and social issues. And a lot of people were thrilled about that. But at the same time, a lot of the music was depressing. And, you know, what happened to all the fun stuff? And why can't we have both? Well, that was one of my objections. But this is an issue where we need to think about whether we want to do that kind of thing or whether we're just trying to tell an adventure yarn. You know, I wrote this book, The Everfiend. It's just an adventure yarn. There's no serious commentary in there. And I knew that before I ever wrote it. Some of my other stuff, I do want to do that. As far as how do you know when you've done that, that's a tough question. I think it helps to just understand when it's part of the story or whether it's just a distraction. And part of what I'm getting at there too is I remember reading The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde when I was younger, and then I read it a few months ago again, probably because I have all this time thanks to the coronavirus. And when I was younger, I felt like there were passages where he was just kind of going off about something, and they were very philosophically oriented. And as a guy in my 20s, it was, you know, I had some interest in that kind of stuff, but I felt it was distracting to the story, and I started to skip over some of the stuff. When I read the book a couple months ago, I was on the lookout for those passages because I was curious, and I never noticed them. So obviously they didn't get deleted. Apparently this time when I read them, they registered with me, and I liked what I was reading, and I didn't think this is not part of the story. And that partly brings up a point here that some of what we think is integral to the story, someone else may think it's not, and they may say, this can be cut, and you're philosophizing here, and I don't care about this. Let's just get on with it. So I think you just have to have an understanding of whether what you're talking about is part of the story. When I write what I think of as literary stories, I purposely think of scenes that will allow me to do that. It's just like with the world building, where if I need to get across some world building stuff, I try to think of a scene where I can reveal that naturally rather than exposition. So that's how I would approach that. And I'm about to look at Mark. I think Mark just sent me an email. He says he's asking, is there a delay? Oh, I think 3 people were waiting. Okay. All right, for those of you who are just joining us, I apologize if I didn't see the thing saying that you were waiting to get in, but don't worry, this is being recorded. And Mark, I see that you joined. You joined just in time. I was just about to answer your question. We are about at the 24-minute mark. So if you want to catch this from the beginning when I post it, I would just, you'll be able to start at the beginning and go up to about the 24-minute mark. And for those of you who just joined, please remember to leave your video and your microphones off. If you have questions, or comments, feel free to type them into the chat. So Mark had a question here, and he said he is focusing on cultural differences. So far, they can be identified, broadly speaking, as 3 different groups. One of them is a society of people with an interesting belief system for the afterlife with a matriarchal spiritual leader. I'm going to refer to that as the religious one as we continue here. The second one is a trading society that does trading of goods and culture. Although I'm not sure how you trade culture, maybe I'm misreading that. And then there's another one. The third one is an early empire with a kind of Attila the Hun-like character who is the leader. They're still hunter-gatherers, farming, and they're always on the move, and they do assimilating of others. And he said the leader has just started creating job expertise for efficiency rather than everyone being a generalist. So he said, are there any thoughts for next steps on how to give this more depth? And I do have a couple thoughts on this. For the first one, the religious one, we may want to focus on the culture of the religion and how that impacted their dress, their daily life, and their attitudes. If the other 2 cultures are less religious, then this helps set them apart. Now, religion is one of these things where it's sort of internal versus Your second one, you said it's a trading one. The second one may not be really materialistic, but we can make it seem kind of like one is more about the eternal life and the other one is a little bit more focused on the materialistic. So, and that was something that your comments had suggested. If they are transactional and they're focused on the physical world instead of the spiritual one, they may not have an easy time understanding the way the other culture looks at things, and vice versa. We can also focus on their behaviors. For this one, for the trading one, we want to work on their products probably, and this can be influenced by the natural world. So, when we create a product, those of us on this, we're not doing something with the physical world. Most of us, we're writing books. Someone else is chopping down the trees that they get printed out. So, but in a fantasy setting, the products usually have a lot to do with the physical surrounding because it's not something like information technology. So one way to develop them more is to focus on these items that they are going to be trading and creating. And especially, this also leads kind of right into the third group where you said the leader of the third group, I'm thinking of them as horsemen and nomads. You said they're going to start working on specializing things. Well, one of the problems with generalists, of course, is that they don't specialize, and maybe the products that this group creates are not as good as the second society that is really focused on trading and materialism. And I was thinking this second group, the trading one, might almost be a point of inspiration for the third one, where they see all these great things that are better. Let's say that I was going to say something like a wicker chair. The trading one will have wicker chairs. The horsemen, they're probably not because they're not going to be sitting around. But basically, if they're both creating the same type of item, this third group that's just working on becoming specialists, their items are probably not as good as the other groups. So now maybe they are, but that's one way of looking at it. If you disagree, feel free, but you can use that as a way to figure out how to distinguish these from each other. And then another thing I was thinking about here is you talked about this third group, the Attila the Hun character, the leader, trying to force people into developing these expertise. And some people are not going to be okay with that. He's probably going to resist or meet resistance. In a perfect setting, everyone will just go, okay, great, we're all going to do this now. But that's not really what happens. So you could have this character running into opposition within his culture to these changes, and you're running into opposition from these other cultures that probably look at his group of horsemen as a threat of some kind. So this is one way to develop this more richly and have him have multiple issues he needs to worry about. Hopefully you guys cannot hear that siren that's going by. I swear they're not coming from me. So these are some basic ideas on ways that you can develop these guys. If you have more questions, feel free to reach out to me. Hopefully this is helpful to you. Now I have a last question. A couple of you asked this question because it's a very common one. And that is, how much is too much world building when you are creating a world? Or is it based on what your story needs? And how do you know when you've done enough? My first comment is to remember that world building is always optional. And we don't have to do much more than Earth by another name. As the guy who wrote the Art of World Building series, I'm not quite embarrassed by a book that I just returned to a couple of months ago. I wrote it back in 2007. It was Earth by another name. I did almost no world building on this. There was a scene where one of the characters said, yeah, the elves have, I forget the numbers, 12 gods, the dwarves have 7, and the humans have 4, something like that. And I laughed when I read it because I thought, no, they don't. There's only one in the whole book because I only needed one character to care about this. And so you could certainly say, well, that was an oversight. And I had a note on there that I need to go back and do this. But, I read through the whole book. And then when I was going through it again, looking at some of these notes, I thought, there's really no place for me to mention these. And it's partly because I already wrote the book. Now, I could have already developed that stuff and then had some scenes where that came up more, but it wasn't really needed. So, that's a world with very minimal world building. It's standard elves, dwarves. We always say medieval-like society, even though some things are more like Renaissance, but there really wasn't that much world building. So maybe someone will give me grief, maybe they won't. So one of the things I would say is that consider whether you're creating a setting for multiple uses, like a longer set of books or multiple sets of books that aren't related, or if you're just doing something like a short story. The bigger the series, I would say the bigger the world building The smaller it is, the smaller the world building. Another way to decide how much is too much, if you find yourself groaning about, oh God, I have to do this too, well, then don't do it unless it's really important. Listen to that reaction, because that can help you decide whether this is something you really need. Sometimes we want to do it. Sometimes we have a sense that we really need to do this because it's going to impact the story, in which case you already kind of have your answer. So I would also consider, can I use this and how can I use this? Another issue there is if you seldom get around to writing your story because you are always doing world building, that's another reason. And we can sometimes have in our head an intended schedule for when we're going to start a project or finish a project. And if world building is stopping us from doing that and it's not really needed, then maybe we need to pull back on that. However, I have a funny story to tell since we have a few minutes. Years ago, I was writing a story called The Spirit Harvest, and we were talking about this earlier, about the portals that go from one place to another. I needed to have the characters do this, but I decided these were guarded. You can't just walk into one and go somewhere, especially because some of them go to important places, and there might be something valuable there, so it's guarded. So there are guards standing there, and I thought, the main character was a girl, about 12 years old. And I thought, how is she going to get through this portal? So as I was writing the scene of her going there, I kept referring to it as the portal, the portal, the portal. And I thought, after a while, they would have named these portals. They're not just going to call it the portal. So I stopped and thought about it. What am I going to call this? And I ended up calling it a moon gate. And that led me on a 2-month world building odyssey where I just went off creating these moon gates, because I was thinking about, well, why is it called that? And the idea is that the goddess of navigation is also the goddess of moons, because sailors look at the sky and use constellations. So I was thinking about that, and because the reason that came up is this character, these gates, they go from one place to another. Well, obviously you want to go and end up where you're intending to go, not ending up in a volcano or something. So the navigation of this is important. So I thought, okay, the goddess of navigation is probably involved in these in some way. So that led to the idea, okay, that's the goddess of navigation. She's also the goddess of the stars and the moon. So I thought, okay, Moongate, cool name. Well, then that had me thinking about this band King Diamond. That's a metal band. I love these guys. They always do stuff with spirits. There's this whole thing of the silvery moon and how this impacts things. And so I thought, okay, what if this is not just called a moon gate because of the goddess, but what if it has to be powered by the moon? You have to have it standing somewhere where the moon is shining down on it a certain amount of time. Of course, some nights it's going to be overcast and maybe the gate is weaker then. Maybe it doesn't go on at all. Maybe it does, but it doesn't send you where it was supposed to go. So I started working on that. Then I started thinking, well, what about spirits? Because the band King Diamond, they're always talking about ghosts. So I thought, well, these gates are designed for physical people to go through them. What if the gate was open and a ghost went through it? Where would it go? And so I thought about that. Next thing I know, I'm developing this. Well, one thing led to another. This book, The Everfiend, is actually one of the results of that, because I ended up creating this whole land where these gates can deposit a spirit or other people when it's not working correctly. And so I spent about 2 months creating all this stuff. And I ended up with a plot for that. I didn't work on the plot, but I wrote down the ideas for it. And at the end of this, as I'm going through, and I thought, man, all I was trying to do was name these gates. And I just did this incredible amount of world building. There's all sorts of stuff in that book. Magic items, there's the poison pond, there's the Everfiend character. It's this whole land full of stuff that I can use all the time. One of the reasons I let myself do this is that is my main setting that I've been working on and off, for 30 years. So I know I'm probably going to use it sooner or later. I already did use it. There's already other stuff about that setting that I can use for other stories. So that's definitely a situation where I did a bunch of world building I didn't need to do for the story that I was trying to write, but I ended up using it for something else. So I kind of let myself go ahead and do it when it's that setting. But if it wasn't that setting, I would have, slapped my own wrist and stop, you're getting carried away. Or I'd let myself write it down and use it for another setting. So we have to consider whether we're going to use this ever. And, sooner is arguably better than later. So that's one way to consider this. Another question is, how much is too much, or what should you do? I think I know you guys are aware of the accelerated world building course of mine at World Building University. It's usually free. If you guys didn't take it already, the coupon codes have probably expired, but send me an email and I'll send you another one. What that course does is it doesn't tell you how to do this stuff. It just walks you through whether you should or not. And part of what it gets at there is, if you don't do this, what's the consequence? And, is there a way to mitigate that? And part of the point of that is to not get sucked into things you don't need to get sucked into. So, and that's pretty much, my answer for that one. So thank you, and I will see you next time. Take care. If you're unfamiliar with my work on world building, what follows are some short videos, some of which contain info about free resources. The video description has more info as well. Thank you for watching. By the way, if you'd like more stuff to help with world building, my artofworldbuilding.com site has a bunch of free templates that you can download by joining the mailing list. You can click the link in the episode description or the little information button in the upper right-hand corner. There are over 20 of these templates, as you can see from this list. Most of them are Microsoft Word documents, but the 2 calculator ones, which come from my Creating Places book, are Excel spreadsheets that take care of the math for you. You can just type in measurements from a map and find out how long it takes to go somewhere by dragon, wagon, foot, or even ships. If you're enjoying the video, remember to click the like button and subscribe. By the way, this YouTube channel is based on my best-selling book series, The Art of World Building, so if you'd like all this advice written down somewhere, it already is. There's also more detail on everything we're talking about in the books, which are available in ebook, paperback, hardback, and audiobook. They can be found at many libraries, bookstores, and most online retailers like Amazon. Just click the links in the episode description. There's also another book related to the series called 185 Tips on World Building. The content is drawn from all 3 volumes, and this book is usually free as an ebook on Amazon and at other retailers, or sometimes it's only 99 cents. By the way, I founded WorldBuilding University, and you can browse the course selection to see if I've uploaded a course you might like. The link is below in the description. Also, and this is important, if you subscribe to my newsletter, I give out coupon codes for courses, including one to get the Accelerated World Building course for free. It's normally $49. I may put a coupon code in the episode description here, but I can't promise to keep up with that every month. Check it out at worldbuilding.university.